If you're like me, you have an uncanny desire to watch history videos on games you might have played or might not have played about the history of them. Well, that's what this is. This is the history of Foxhole Asymmetry. Hi, I'm Lek. Welcome. In my 8 years of Foxhole, asymmetry is a thing that has only existed since 2020. Now, I know saying that in 2025 might sound like relatively dated. Wow, that sounds like it's existed for a pretty long time. Again, 8 years of playing, it in my head I can still remember a time pre-asymmetry, and I know that there's a lot of people who have only started playing in more recent years and they don't actually have the memory of what Foxhole might have been at one point in time, like pre asymmetry or during a certain period. So I've sort of figured I would go through and give my understanding, my recollection, uh, supported by as well as just not just my own memory, but I've gone through and reviewed some of the updates. In the past, I've reviewed what people had said about them at the time and what people have said about them uh, posthumously, shall we say. Ultimately, here, I just want to give this preface. This is about the balancing and the asymmetry and the history of Foxhole's asymmetry. It's in the title. You've clicked on a video called Foxhole Asymmetry. You're getting Foxhole Asymmetry. But this is not a comprehensive discussion of every single Foxhole meta, of every single aspect of Foxhole. Where applicable, the meta will be discussed, especially towards the end of this video. There are aspects of building and aspects of PvE that are pretty essential to understand the later eras of asymmetry, but for the now, we're going to keep things simple. We're mostly just going to be focusing on the past. In fact, we're going to go so simple, we're going to go to before asymmetry even existed. We're going to go to Foxhole War Machine. Now, if you're actually watching and not listening, you might have noticed I just skipped a slide, and that's because I haven't actually rehearsed this necessarily. If you've watched any of my stuff before, I don't know if you have or haven't, but I do things pretty off the cuff. I don't have a script for this. I have the slides sort of act as a script on their own. If you've ever seen someone bullshit a project, I'm kind of doing that here, where I have a lot of this. I have a shitload of notes, so I might not say everything I want to say, but I'm going to say what I can to the best of my ability. In fact, I'm actually going to go back and just say, in the past, Foxhole pre-asymmetry, there was only really map asymmetry. That's the major thing from this slide. So, anyway, Foxhole War Machine. If you are at all familiar with Foxhole's history, you might think this is a weird thing to bring up, considering this isn't the start of asymmetry. Well, I think if you're probably ahead of me and you've realized, well, you don't want to look necessarily at the moment an event started, but you want to look at the build up to it. So, War Machine was the big Foxhole annual update of 2019. It was a logistics focused update, and it was infamously unpopular. It was the original hex map, so instead of having a 3x3 grid, it gave us the 23 hex original hex world. It also gave us resource scarcity in the form of 20-to-1 ratios, component fields that didn't instantly respawn and instead took like 6 hours to respawn. And obviously, with the world getting bigger, things are more spread out. There was more logistical effort involved in just getting stuff where it needed to be for every single fight. On top of that, there was also things like production parts, which I have just triggered maybe like 5% of people that are listening. Anywho, a year before Foxhole was introduced to asymmetry, you had this update. And while the devs spent about a year trying to, or not a year, it was a couple months trying to undo the damage of this update, this was the framework in which Foxhole players started experiencing asymmetry. They they got Foxhole Asymmetry as the major update off the back of a massive change in what Foxhole was, towards the new scarcity focused, attrition focused, generally bigger experience that was the War Machine update. So now I'm going to skip ahead a bit, and I'm going to go to how our Modern Wars won. You might think this is odd, considering I was just speaking of the past, but this will get back to the past in just a second. So if you've ever played a modern Foxhole War, and you were wondering how they are won if you don't already know, it's have enough players and continue having enough players. The only way modern Foxhole Wars are won is when the opponent logs off. That's it. You do not win when you take a Logi hub, you do not win when you capture all the VPs. You win when the enemy logs off, so you can actually take like all of the territory required, and you can deal the like final morale blow to keep them demoralized enough that you can continue to just like slowly take all the territory and keep killing Conk and all that. I know that's painting a pretty grim picture. That's partly my opinion, partly what I think is the truth on modern Foxhole. It's a very attrition-heavy game. The only way to win is to log on. The only way to lose is to log off. Now, connecting back to the past, this wasn't always true. In the past, it used to be have enough players, obviously. It's not like population wasn't a big deal back in the day. However, there were actual ways to win. There were capturing / nuking an enemy Logi hub. And you might think, well, hang on. If I'm doing that, if I nuke or capture an enemy Logi hub, I've probably already won at that point. And you would be wrong, actually. Back in the day, in Update 26, and all through the year leading up to Arms Race, you saw many players like fighting over these last stand situations for nuking Logi hubs or capturing Logi hubs, because the thing is, people didn't just give up before they got to the Logi hub, because the chances are you would be fighting over Logi hub relatively like early into a war. And when I say relatively early, I mean before the end of a tech tree, because in modern Foxhole the tech tree always ends before there's any fighting near a Logi hub, unless one faction just has not logged on. Again, have enough players, don't not have enough players. But in the past, it looked like, again, push the outer lanes, because being a hex-shaped world, the outer lanes were always closer to the enemy Logi hubs, and yeah, and that's how it would generally go. There were far more opportunities for individual plays to have a war-winning effect, and ultimately, the game was less attrition-focused, more, I want to say skill, but it's really hard to say exactly what it was, but there was more strategy necessarily involved, because if you could demoralize an individual opponent, if you could pull off a single, or maybe just a small few key operations, you could have a chance of flipping a war on its head off of just that, right? It was very easy to win pretty quickly if you did just a couple of things right, and the enemy made a couple of blunders, right? With all of that established now, here's the asymmetrical wrench. Foxhole Arms Race. While there was a lot of things that happened in between like War Machine and Arms Race, most of that was content updates related to building, or a few minor tank addition, actually not tank additions, but small arms additions, that sort of thing. There wasn't anything like super earth-shaking until this, which was what people were not expecting, asymmetrical vehicles. And it certainly threw a wrench into balancing, because, I mean, you go from a perfectly even state to, well, some pretty botched balance. The Colonials just did not have a medium tank at the time, and at the time of Arms Race, both factions did have battle tanks, so medium tanks, it's not like medium tanks were coming out and medium tanks were the only tank in the game, and so it was light tanks against medium tanks. Except it kind of was, because what wound up happening, like in the earliest arms race wars, is the devs had also tweaked the tech tree, so you saw things like the Colonials getting no battle tanks, fighting against Warden battle tanks and Silver Hands like a tier earlier. And on top of that, the Silver Hand could also go toe-to-toe with battle tanks at quite a cheaper price. Now, that isn't to say it would like wholesale slaughter all of the battle tanks, but it was a pretty obscene tank for the time, especially on initial release, especially against light tanks, because it wasn't a battle tank, so it didn't tech with battle tanks, it teched slightly before them. It represented a pretty huge like power spike. On top of all of this, there was also no Warden 250. And now, this doesn't really matter during arms race itself, but it will matter in a couple of months. There was also the Ascension battle tank, which, if you were familiar with the time, was a 45-meter battle tank, while everything else in the game was at max 40-meter range. And for simplicity's sake, it was pretty obscenely busted. I will say something that's interesting is I do wonder retrospectively if it would have been busted if players had figured out the same strategies to counter super tanks, which is to sack a bunch of like lower value vehicles in to just individually target the super expensive like high cost vehicle. Difference is though is that BTs at the time only cost RMATs. They didn't require anything to do with facilities, because facilities just don't exist at this point. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say with all of this is that you're getting a really negative experience if you're a Colonial. This initial arms race update was just very heavily slanted in the Warden's favor, because at the time, the reason that the Warden's not having a 250 at the time wasn't as big a deal is because this era of Asymmetry had a significantly higher amount of options for dealing with concrete, as well as concrete just was not nearly as good at this point, because there was a number of different buffs and different things that people learned over time that made concrete get better, along with builders just learning how to build better, and a few different other things. Most notably was field artillery. Field artillery was an old symmetrical artillery piece that remained into arms race, and that was one of the easiest to use conch killers that sort of made it so that, well, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. What ultimately happened is that you had highly fluid front lines defined by tank fights, build pushing, and making the most of your manpower, where one faction has multiple far superior tanks. That's the long and short of it. Foxhole was a far more fluid game. Like I just said, conch wasn't nearly as good, builders weren't nearly as good, and it was far easier to destroy and build, so you often saw territory swinging a lot more rapidly based on the actual tanks and infantry kit that you had at the time. One faction having a far better tank lineup just ultimately meant that one faction had a massive advantage, and I don't think you'd find anyone that disputes this. So, what did the devs do? They have added this horribly imbalanced update, and now one faction is just very much complaining about the fact that they got shafted hard. So the first thing they did was they removed the Ascension BT. It was just very obscene. A 45-meter BT, while everything else in the game had 40 meters of range. You're kind of asking for just something a little bit stupid. But even then, that wasn't really enough. The Silverhand, again, was this very, very strong tank. It's kind of hard to put into words how strong it is for one faction to just have an entire class of vehicle while the other team just doesn't. Especially when that class of vehicle is a late game, high speed, high damage, just just it was very obscene to just have that silver hand exist with no rival. So the silver hand became far more of a problem than the Ascension ever was, especially after they removed battle tanks, but that happens later. The initial solution after the Ascension was removed was the devs added the Colonial Mortar half track. Now, if you know anything about modern half track or the modern mortar vehicles, mortars aren't really a late game thing. I mean, the mortar vehicles will see use primarily as a flare round thing for supporting pushes, but back in the day, this thing was a fucking monster. There, like, I have to, I cannot stress this. This was before they tweaked all of the arty stuff, so mortars had 700 damage as opposed to, I think, 400. It says on the slide 400, and I know I looked this up. In my brain, it's saying my brain is saying 300 damage, but I'm pretty sure it's 400 damage. Feel free to look it up. Either way, it was a huge amount of damage, rapid fire, and on top of that, there was no wind, there was no deviation. It was just a straight, flat up, like 65-meter, just rapid fire machine gun of ranged damage, right? And on top of that, it also had an armor piercing round, which did, I think, like 1,000 anti-tank damage, which meant that if you were good enough, you could just kind of destroy enemy armor. Though that wasn't the AP ammo was more of a cherry on top, because if things lasted to the late game, the silver hand was just way easier to use and often just did better. But what made the MHT kind of obscene is a little quirk of the time, which was tech gambling. So instead of having a single tier that you're progressing at once, you instead had multiple options per tier that you could choose to tech from, one of which would be unlocked, the other of which would be just completely locked. You don't get it, not until the tech tree loops around, which just doesn't happen in this era of Foxhole. And on top of that, you could gamble up to a couple tiers ahead of the actual tech tier that you were at. So right at the start of a war, you'd have 100% chance of making tech progression if you did tier 1, 80% on tier 2, 60% on tier 3, 40% on tier 4. And so if you know anything about prototypes, you know that prototypes aren't very good in Foxhole, especially in this era where they could not be repaired, making any direct combat vehicles pretty just dog shit, shall we say. Now, the mortar half track was, because it was placed in tier 4, that meant it was available on day 1 before binoculars were unlocked. People had to use their eyes and just wing it for using the MHT. If you can imagine what it's like, one faction having a 700 damage rapid fire mortar half track, while the other side just doesn't, Colonials just won wars in the early game purely off of this vehicle. It was incredibly silly, and you had entire regions falling because of just how absurd this was. The mortar half-track thing is probably one of the main reasons why they had to rework tech gambling and tone it down, because it just resulted in some hilarious things where you had certain things that were not direct combat vehicles that, if you got them early, just gave you such an immense advantage. Now, because of this, they do Band-Aid solutions again, because Colonials have this absurd early game mortar half track that just wins them wars, and Colonials have, and Wardens have this absurd late game vehicle in the Silverhand. So Colonials lacked a late game tank, Wardens lacked a 250, and the mortar half track was just obscene. So what happens is the Colonials receive the light tank destroyer, which, if you've ever played Warden, Wardens hated this fucking thing for good reason, as well as as well as in addition to the LTD, Wardens received the Push 250, and the Mortar Half Track lost its AP ammo because now you have the LTD, which is meant to be your actual late game tank if you're the Colonials, right? So, as a side note, battle tanks were removed in the same update, but this didn't really have a huge effect because, again, wars, if the Colonials went really hard in the early game and Wardens weren't going as hard, it was very likely that Colonials would just immediately win. And if a war lasted long enough to get to Silverhand tier, most Colonials just mass logged off because they knew they were about to lose, right? So the removal of BTs just didn't really have that much effect, especially because, well, the results are highly fluid front lines defined by tank fights, build pushing, and making the most of your manpower, where one faction has a far superior tank. Now, if this sounds familiar, that's because this is the exact same problem Arms Race had, except the difference is that instead of the Silverhand being the super dominant tank, you now have the LTD, which is designed as an exact Silverhand counter. Now, the LTD is an exclusive anti-tank vehicle. It does not have any anti-structure capability, but in the era, that didn't matter as much because most of the time, you kill the enemy tanks, you just push uncontested because you get to do all your arty, you get to do all your RPG stuff, you just get to bulldoze the front line once the enemy tanks are gone. That's usually how the era operated. Now, here comes the double down. So the LTD just sort of invalidated the Silverhand, as I was saying. Wardens lacked early game PvE, and the Mortar Half Track is a little too strong in the early game. So what do the devs do? They slightly nerf the LTD in a couple of ways. The Wardens receive the Push 40, and the Mortar Half Track is no longer an early game technology. It gets moved to, I want to say tier 7 or 8, around light tank tier for a good while. It wouldn't go back to, I believe in modern Foxhole, it's around a tier 6 unlock. It's like a tier or two after. It's either the same. Actually, here's where I'm sort of exposing myself. I don't use the Mortar Half Track in modern Foxhole. It's just not my type of vehicle. I actually don't know when it unlocks. I know it's. I don't know if it's tied to facilities or anyway. That's a side tangent. Because of all of this, you're going to see another complete inversion of the balance pendulum. The result is highly fluid front lines defined by vehicle fights, build pushing, and making the most of your manpower, where one faction can only win in the early game and the other faction can only win in the late game. This is a complete inversion from what was just happening a few months prior, where the Colonials now have the far superior late game option, and the Wardens have the Push 40. Now, I didn't really mention it at the time, but the Push 40, you might think oh, the Push 40, that was a problem? How is that a problem? I barely see that thing ever making a huge deal of progress these days, right? That's never the big thing that's affecting front lines these days. This was a different era of Foxhole. Keep in mind, everything I've mentioned that has been added is about as much as was added to the game at this point. There was so much less to both factions' arsenals that one faction had a 40mm option in the early game, and the other faction, Colonials, just didn't have anything. There wasn't... Mortars were a late game unlock at the time, so there wasn't really any early game infantry PvE. There were only vehicle options, and even then, those vehicle options were usually not very good. It was basically just armored cars, and if you know anything about armored cars, Wardens also had the hack, but that would come later. That wasn't a thing at this point. It was one faction has a 40mm vehicle in tier 1, 2, or 3. The other faction has an incredibly oppressive anti-tank vehicle in the late game. So one faction either wins quickly or the other faction wins late game. Again, total inversion. Now, here's where the asymmetrical wrench comes in again. You might be noticing this is a very back and forth period. There's a reason that players came up with the term the balance pendulum, because just like one of those little desk pendulums with the I don't know what it's called. Is it like the Newton ball, or is it the Einstein whatever? I don't know. You'll know what those are called. You can Google it. I'm not Googling it right now, but it basically, as rapid as those, or as rapid as a metronome, would go tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, back and forth, whoever was at a massive advantage. At first, in arms race, it was the Wardens by a lot, and then it was the Colonials in the early game, Wardens in the late game, and then it was Wardens in the early game, Colonials in the late game. Now, with Winter Army, you get artillery and infantry asymmetry. I should mention, or I did mention that asymmetry was only on the things that I had mentioned. Now we're getting into the point where you start to see a resemblance to modern Foxhole. This was a major update because the balance issues of arms race were severely affecting the player base. This needed to be a good update because the player count was very low at this point. Now, the update focused on finalizing the asymmetry and bringing it to the other areas that were not previously explored, primarily artillery and infantry. So, now, the question, would it be balanced? We'll see. Yes and no. Okay, so Winter Army had some of the strongest infantry tools like that existed prior, like the RPG, going to be Warden exclusive as the Cutler, while the Colonials got the ISG in its original form. Now, if you're a modern Foxhole player on the Warden faction as a newer player, you might see an ISG and you might get a little frustrated when fighting it. It's this 40 meter, like, very cheap ammo thing that you have to face off again against every single early game of every single war, right? And it's frustrating because they just line up a bunch of these and they outrange all your stuff and they just slowly pepper your stuff, right? The thing is, any Warden of this era will tell you it used to be a lot worse. So the ISG, it has I believe a 2 or 3 second reload speed today. At this time, it had a 0.5 second reload speed with its ammo costing half of what it does today. This is what I mean by yes and no. The Cutler was very strong, but the original ISG was fucking bonkers, okay? So this solved the issue of one faction having only one faction having a strong early game. Both factions suddenly had a very strong early game. Primarily, Colonials had a stronger early game, and then Wardens had a big power spike around tier 4, tier 5, and then like going into the mid game, Wardens were at an advantage, and then we'll get to the rest. But the other aspects of it were the artillery. So in 120 millimeter, things were kind of Colonial favored, where the 120 millimeter push gun had better accuracy and fire rate and didn't have to be set up in a... Well, technically the Warden one doesn't have to be put in a pit either, but if you've ever tried to do artillery with any kind of emplaced artillery gun, you know that putting it outside of a pit is kind of a death sentence with the way that the resistances and the HP on those work. But the counter to this, though, was that in the 150 millimeter department, you had the Thunderbolt, which is, to this day, the most unusable piece of trash in the fucking game. Like, it's technically used because it's, like, the only non-SPG 150 that Colonials get. Aside from battleships these days, but we're focusing on on the past here. So the 150 is extremely Warden favored, 120 is kind of Colonial favored. So what you might say, okay, well, if you just said Wardens had the bigger power spike in the mid game, main reason for this is because the way the tech works is Artillery is on the infantry tech tier, meaning that oftentimes wardens would get cutler and artillery at the same time, whereas colonials would get like just artillery. And you might think, oh, just artillery? What, you're underselling it? Well, the cutler the cutler very strong at this time. Again, ISG was also very strong, but ISG comes out a bit earlier, so you notice the bigger power spike on the wardens because they're playing a little game of catch up where they're weaker at the beginning and then they're like stronger in that mid game spot. So what are the ultimate results? Well, Foxhole again was still way less attrition based. Artillery was plentiful, but not nearly to the extent that it was today. Like, if you're wondering why I'm saying this, so at the time there were no facilities. So there were no facilities, there were no pallets. You had to put all of your artillery ammo crates into a bunker base that you were at. And from there, you had to all of your artillery operations were tied to bunker bases. So they were far less easy to set up, they were far less easy to run, they were far more manpower intensive, they were way less easy to spam because there weren't just thousands of pallets of ammo just sitting around. Artillery was just less impactful. Just straight up. It was just way less impactful. You still had a game that was very much focused around dynamic, fluid fights of tanks and infantry with artillery supporting, right? So, ultimately, with all of these things added, with all of the things certain things being super weak, like the Thunderbolt, certain things being super strong, like the ISG, or just across the board, things were technically balanced, but not really in an item-to-item way. I haven't covered this here, because, and if you're a Warden player, you might be screaming bias right now, but there was one other thing added this update, which was the Falchion, which, if you're a Warden player of this era, you might think, oh, the Falchion was obscenely strong when it was first added. Everyone knows that it was totally busted with its MPF bonus being yada yada yada. Thing you gotta remember is that the Falchion was strong for being a brick. So this isn't like part of the notes here, like in the slides, because I don't think the Falchion actually had that much of an effect on the balancing of on the balancing of, like, I don't think the Falchion had much effect on balancing. I think really what it did was it was more of a morale thing, where it was seen as this unique capability that the Colonials were getting that the Wardens weren't getting, that felt very upsetting, because it felt like, oh, well, we can kill these tanks very easily, and they aren't very threatening, but killing them doesn't feel very rewarding because they're so heavily spammed, right? The thing was, the damage that the Falchion did was very much more mental than anything, and the real power in the Colonial late game came from the Falchion being paired with the LTD. So if you're wondering why it's not in the slides here, it's because I don't think the tank balance actually changed that much in the late game. It was like slightly Colonial favored, and you'll notice that sort of bore out in the outcome with the Colonials winning Winter Army if you go and check. But this is where I need to get to a very important point, because this sort of impacts how everything about modern Foxhole works, and it's the concept of balancing inertia. So, although there was a huge amount of balance swings where one faction would be going from completely dominant to unable to actually have a chance at winning, even part of the reason for that is because if the devs didn't do that at the time, there's a large chance that even if things were technically balanced, they wouldn't feel balanced if you were the previously underpowered side. So what I mean by that is, I think that Winter Army technically was balanced. I think that Colonials had slight advantages in tanks. I think the Wardens had advantages in artillery and in infantry. I think the Cutler scaled way better into the late game, although the ISG was very obscene. You're not wrong if you want to say ISG was obscene at the time. It was fucking broken, okay? But I think there was... Winter Army was an era where so many different things were broken for both factions that I don't think it was actually that much of a case of the previous things, which was just one side not having a capability at all. Instead, it was more just a matter of Wardens were in a bad spot before Winter Army, so they just, when they didn't get an easy win, they just felt like the balance was still off. So they logged off and they didn't really have as much fun, and they complained a lot about balance. And the thing is, I don't think they're wrong for necessarily feeling like that, because, again, it's sort of that the frame of referencing that we have of balance as people is sort of tethered to the where it was previously. So, as an example, if you know anything about negotiating, you want to set a price of something. You want to be the first person to set the price of something, right? Because that tethers the perceived value to a set number that you've dictated. Oftentimes, that's not your actual value. You'll often either times say, oh, I want to sell this I will only sell this thing at this price, and then you negotiate down to your actual price. Or you say, I will only buy this at X price, and then you'll either get a discount from what you're actually willing to pay, because the price will get negotiated upward afterwards. But the thing is, if you say the actual price that you are willing to buy it at immediately, I know this is a side tangent. You're going to get a lot of tangents. We have a long ways to go in this. This might wind up being a 2-hour-long video. I haven't checked the runtime. You'll know it. You'll check it right now and see, oh god, he goes off on so many more tangents. And yeah, I bet I do. So, ultimately, how Winter Army goes is that because the Wardens saw that they were getting all of these very powerful things, so they showed up in mass, and then they couldn't quite finish the war, and then Colonials just kept sticking it out, and the Wardens sort of lost their momentum and got pushed on the back foot, and then they lost. And it felt really bad. It felt like evidence that Colonials still had the super late game advantage with the LTD and the falchion and all of that, right? But I think that it was more of a perceived value or a perceived imbalance issue rather than necessarily a strict imbalance issue. Like, yeah, all of this ties into morale. If you previously had balance tilted against you, making the scales equivalent does not feel like balance. It just doesn't. It's human nature. Anyway, because of this, because things were more towards technically balanced, this is where you start to get the devs leaning back into the more wild swings on balance, because they start to realize they have to not only balance around what the actual stats are, but they actually have to balance around how people are perceiving balance also, where you get an infamous quote from the devs regarding the player power curve, which at the time sounded completely outlandish, but I think history has somewhat validated this, because at the end of the day, you do notice people will still complain about balance in the modern era, even in cases where there might be less balance, like things might be more or less balanced, but that's, again, getting ahead of myself. So, fixing morale through imbalance. Because of the issue, the devs decide that following Winter Army, they're going to focus on really trying to hammer home, give the Wardens a couple wins, right? So, the Colonials, I should add, the Colonials just didn't have an SMG in Winter Army. This is funny, but it's not especially important. But but it'll be funny for like a minute from now, for a couple minutes from now. The Wardens received the HTD, which at the time it didn't technically have armor. This is like a weird moment with the LTD where it was like for a month or two it just didn't really have armor. It kind of did, but it kind of didn't because things were a little bit weird in the armor system at the time. This was before something I'll get to in a minute, the armor rework. Ultimately, the initial reaction to Winter Army didn't actually shake up balance enough to really bring the Warden morale back. So, major reason for that was players were starting to get better at building. Concrete was becoming more of a problem. 250 started to be, like, late game 250mm access became a really important thing. The Ballista, as bad as it was, or as bad as its stats were, was just the only late game viable 250mm platform. So, the balance pendulum, as it did, swung. And it, ignore this slide. TLDR, there was oftentimes a meme at the time where Colonials would get no good small arms because they'd be placed way at the end of the tech tree. That's all the context you're getting. Oh, never mind. You can tell this is unscripted. I forgot this was the next slide. Yeah, basically a lot of things. So like the Colonial SMG, Wardens would get the Fiddler, like tier 2. So they'd just have an SMG throughout most of the war, whereas the Colonial SMG, the Lion Claw, would get placed all the way at like tier 8 or tier 9, and often against something like an HMG, or against like satchels, or against the Dusk, or just against something that was way more powerful, to the point where it was incredibly obvious why the SMG was like put there. It was basically to say, hey, you're not getting this war, so that the other faction will just dominate in this one area and they'll have a better time because their morale's been shit lately. Anywho, like, if you're wondering what I mean by player power curve and like balancing around morale, the devs got really creative with how they did things, where they wouldn't so much like tweak the stats necessarily, but they'd often do very funny things due to the way the tech tree worked, and they'd just put stuff in spots where one faction just wouldn't get a piece of tech for one war, and that was just how it was. But yeah, that was more of a footnote on the larger story, because well, the armor update. So although there was like a slight balance problem in Winter Army, especially with the lack of 250mm, this is what I'm calling surgery with a sledgehammer, where I was one of the biggest advocates. I said, hey, the Wardens just completely lack a late game 250. This is kind of bullshit. And then I saw what the devs gave as a late game 250, and I completely regretted ever advocating for that, because it was the Chieftain. And if you know anything about the Chieftain versus the Ballista, especially before the Ballista got its buffs in the Naval update, those two vehicles are not comparable. Like, the Ballista has more ammo than the Chieftain, but the Chieftain just... you can hear my brain breaking as I'm trying to explain how absurd it was that one faction got a slow-moving, low-armored, like, moderate health, like, 250 platform, and the other faction got a similar HP, high armor, MG, fast-moving 250mm. Like, every single stat except for HP was just 10 times better on the Chieftain. It was so absurd. Now, on top of that, the armor update also did a few different things, which was they made armor a viable stat in the game, and it made it so that if you're familiar with how modern tank fights go, it's very much a line fight meta. Now, line fighting has always been a thing in Foxhole. I'm not about to claim that you didn't have line fighting before this, but the main reason that the Falchion was good, and the main reason the LTD was good, was that it outranged everything, And you could always win trades at range because you had this HP brick that, although it would always take damage whenever it engaged, had so much HP and had such a high repair rate that you could just back up after every trade, repair very easily, and then engage very quickly. What armor did was it made it so that oftentimes you would engage, deal no damage to the enemy, take damage, and you just didn't have the high HP, didn't have the high repair rate. You just had a really shitty tank suddenly, and the LTD. The LTD was still very strong for having the only 45 meter range tank in the game at the time. HDD almost had the same range, but it had about 2 meters of difference, especially when you factor in ping and weird angling and weird approach angles and all this stuff. Essentially, the LTD was the only real strong tank the Colonials had at this point, and it was fighting against the HTD, the Chieftain. Well, the Chieftain wasn't fighting it, but the point is that there was a lot of really strong stuff, and I'm not including, at least at this moment, another huge aspect of this update that I'll get to in a second, but pretty much the Chieftain, the HD, everything about tanks suddenly was very much more slanted towards Wardens. It wasn't totally slanted. You still had you still had some viability in the LTD, but we're gonna get to where this is going in a second. So, okay, I guess I didn't mention it in my slides here, but there was the high velocity push guns. So when the slide here says Colonials were heavily relying on infantry, this was mainly because of the smelter. Now, if you're a modern Foxhole player, you might think, oh, the Stygian, that's the Colonials' super strong push gun for anti-tank. That's why the Colonials are the infantry faction, because they... No. The smelter was a 45 meter range, rapid fire, high velocity 68 millimeter. So if you think about all the downsides that the Stygian has, or the old Stygian has, I should say, the 1.0 version, not the Naval update version of the Stygian, it was a 40 meter range, very slow, high damage but low ammo capacity gun, right? It would often just times straight up kill stuff, right? The smelter also outranged everything and had super high DPS and could stay in a fight for a long time because it didn't have to get a bunch of ammo. It didn't have a resupply truck tethered to it as a way to keep in the fight. It was just a very, very strong anti-tank option that the Colonials relied on as an infantry focused thing. It made the Colonials have to rely way more on having strong infantry, even though, as mentioned, because of tech shenanigans, sometimes Colonials just didn't have a super strong infantry game. Anyway, this was a very weird time, and it kind of gets doubled down on with entrenching the late game meta. So Entrenched brought with it a broken tank. This was the Outlaw. And when I say broken, I mean broken in the very literal sense of the word. Not in the it was overpowered, but in the sense that it sort of broke the way that both the game was designed and the fact that its hitbox just was broken, so half the time you'd shoot it and your shot would just phase through it. So it was half the... And this lasted for the entire war it was added, right? It didn't get hotfixed until the next war, so it was kind of tilting as a colonial. But the biggest thing was at the time emplacements. The emplaced anti-tank guns had a limit of 40 meters of range. The Outlaw is a 45 meter anti-structure option. Having an emplaced gun that can't move, that's outranged by the thing it's supposed to counter, it just kind of made it so you couldn't really do anything. And on top of that, the Outlaw finally could contest LTDs very easily. So LTDs just sort of took a major hit this update as being a super viable thing. So as well as the Bardiche being a 35 meter thing just Colonials did not have any good line fighting vehicles, and considering line fights are how tank fights just work in this game, Colonials just were no longer a tank faction. Now, I want to just I want to get. It's hard to put this at like any one point in time, but it was around this era where Foxhole started. Actually, no, I actually can put this distinctly to this time because Entrenched increased the map size, and this was a big deal because suddenly wars started taking way longer. Now, because wars took longer, the part of the tech tree that actually mattered basically exclusively became late game. Like, it does not matter as much, I should say, because the devs were still doing their tech shenanigans in this era. It does not matter what you have on tier 5. All that matters post-entrenched is how does your arsenal, just in its entirety, shake up against the entire arsenal of the enemy team, right? So, how does that actually look in practice? Well, Colonials have the super overpowered Smelter, the Ignifist, and the infamous Bane Gang. The Bane, very, very solid option of this era. I think it got some movement speed and some weight nerfs shortly after, but the Colonials were a very infantry-focused faction. Colonials had the Ignifist as their disposable anti-tank option, the Bane as a non-disposable infantry-focused option, and the Smelter as their push gun of just smelting down the metal of tanks. It was very, very... These were all very strong options, but none of them were tanks. None of them were highly mobile. They were all relatively cheap and relatively easy to get fielded in high numbers, but none of them were necessarily had the same factor of momentum that tanks tend to in this game. So Wardens, just total armor dominance. They have their own overpowered push gun in the HV40, which was often used by certain vets like Aldelar to kill Conk in very effective fashion. As well as the Chieftain being an anti-conk and anti-infantry vehicle. It's hard to say because I feel like, let me be clear, this is sort of the same thing about Winter Army, where both factions had very strong options. The difference is that it's sort of a regression from Winter Army, where instead of both factions having strong options in most categories, it's instead that both factions have a strong focus. Colonials have strong infantry, Wardens have strong armor. It's sort of balanced. But it's like, if you're a Colonial tank player, you would not think it's balanced, not in the fucking slightest, holy shit. And if you're a Warden infantry focused player, you'd see, oh well, Colonials get all these super easy, super disposable ways. Oh no, it's another Bane. I'm dying to Banes. I'm dying to Ignifist. This is so upsetting. This is so frustrating. Like, it was kind of balanced, but very much bad experiences depending on what type of gameplay you were after. So, yeah, ultimately, if you were Warden infantry, it sucked. If you were a Colonial tanker, it sucked. But you didn't know who would win in an update. Now, there was an update during this period which got a very funny name based on a niche internet micro-celebrity that was very vocal about the state of balance at the time. The Moidawg update. Now, as funny as it was calling it the Moidawg update and looking at all the very silly ways that the balance was decided, this was very much an update that much more... It had a higher impact against Colonials. I think if I remember rightly, there were some things that shook out, but the infantry balance ultimately remained mostly the same, but there were a couple things that really were felt. It was an infantry focused update, primarily on making the automatics like the Dusk, the Lion Claw, the Fiddler, the Storm Rifle making them worse and making the default weapons better. So this is a thing that most people aren't familiar with, but the way that the devs tend to balance things in Foxhole is they don't actually necessarily balance based on trying to make every single item or option viable. They balance based on trying to make things seem aesthetically correct, if that makes any sense. This isn't like me quoting something directly. This is me saying, like, the devs tend to want, at least during this area, certain weapons to be like the primary weapon of the army of the colonials. So like if you think about it less like you're playing a game and more like the devs are trying to focus on emulating like a real life army where you're going to have your mainstays that are used in large quantities, and then you're going to have your like niche side grades that are experimental and they've got their upsides and their downsides. Generally, the way that the devs wanted it to shake out was that the composition of your forces would sort of form towards how the devs saw as what are the main weapons and what are the side grades, right? And they did this via balance to, I would argue, the detriment of gameplay, but this is like a super off top, like this is just more of a contextual thing than actually getting into what was happening at the time. This is just how things were filtered through to balance. So ultimately, the most impactful aspect of this update was the nerfing of the Ignifist and the buffing of the White Ash, as well as the nerfing of the Bane. Thing is that because of all the way that things shook out, Colonials just had a very strong rifle in the Argenti, so Colonials just still did pretty well in infantry fights. Like the infantry v infantry was still very Colonial favored, with things like the Katara and the Argenti just being two very strong options, and the Wardens having a lot of strong options, but nothing that quite rose to the same level. Ultimately, what this sort of update did was made it so that the Colonials were basically tethered to the singular option that they had that was incredibly, like, obscenely strong, which was the Smelter. That was it. That was all Colonials had for the most part. There were, like, the Bane was still viable, but not far weaker. It was just weaker, but the Smelter became the clear, undisputed champion of the Colonials. So, like, ultimately, yeah, you Colonials lacking the Ignifist could no longer cheaply, like, kill tanks, but the ultimate balance, like, the balance pendulum just didn't really swing that hard. Wardens did see a period of success after this, but it wasn't like a drawn-out, like, oppressive win streak where the Colonials had no chance. It was mostly the morale thing of the fact that, as mentioned, people called it the Moidawg update because a lot of the balance changes that occurred sort of seemed to fall in line with a lot of complaints that the streamer Moidawg had at the time. How much this is true or not, there was certainly a lot of overlap. I don't think it's fair to attribute it all to him. I do think his balance takes were complete dog shit, though, for the most part, and I don't think he helped, I don't think his voice helped much in the direction of, like, pushing towards better balance. But I wouldn't. I think the Moidawg update as like a meme was sort of overblown, and ultimately the impact was more on morale than on actual balance. But as mentioned, morale starts to have a pretty huge effect, especially at this era of Foxhole. So where does that leave us after like months of like sort of okay but slightly Warden favored? You get Foxhole Inferno. Everything is on fire. I don't know how to start this. This was a clusterfuck of balancing. So everything is on fire. Fire, fire, fire. Oh my god, there was so much fire. It was an update, certainly. It was an update of all time. Fire was just everywhere. The bunkers, the servers, everything. Armat positive. Lose an entire region. But at least you killed the wasp nest. At QRF, Loggerhead, fire. There's your niche reference, fucking MSA goons from 2022 playing in Drowned Vale. What did 1.0 and Inferno mean for balance? Well, not much actually changed. So, fire was the most obvious point of imbalance, but most of the issues with fire were front-loaded, where Wardens basically had exclusive access to fire rockets. So, at the time, and pretty much until modern day, fire rockets were the only valuable type of rocket, especially in Inferno, because fire at the time, if you set concrete on fire, concrete on fire could, I believe, go all the way up to tier 5 fires, at which point putting it out would become incredibly difficult, even on concrete. So what would often happen is Wardens would swap over borders, unleash a volley of Skycaller rockets with like 2 or 3 of them, and instantly your entire base would be on fire. I think at the time, because fire rockets were very overtuned, there was often cases where a single fire rocket would land on your Bob core, and you could not do anything anymore. Your Bob was dead. It was like a full tier, like, it was like 50% on fire. It was technically possible to put it out, but there was no way to react to it in time unless you were already proactively prepared for it. And that was only if one rocket landed on your Bob core. Like, it's kind of hard to overstate how just monumentally overtuned fire was for, like, that brief period. Like, especially in regards to the first slide, the joke slide, it's not an exaggeration that, like, across the entire front line, Colonials lost so much territory purely because, like, the wasp nest. And you might think, oh, the wasp nest? Who the fuck uses that? No one uses the wasp nest. It's a piece of shit, right? No one uses this. No one likes this, right? Thing is, when one rocket is fully able to kill a Bob core, even the world's worst rocket, even a rocket push gun, just breaks the game, right? Like, 5 days of pushing to take most of Marben Hollow was undone in, like, 3 hours with a single push gun. We managed to kill the wasp nest, but then another one arrived in, like, 30 seconds because it was already being brought up. And it was the most demoralizing thing I've ever seen, and I know a lot of people just immediately logged off until they had to hotfix to, like, nerf fire rockets. And even then, it was still very, very, very strong. Just not, like, one rocket setting a Bob on fire level of strong. Now, here's the real lasting impact of Inferno is facilities. So, if you remember Winter Army, where I said, like, artillery balance doesn't matter as much because you're tied to Bob cores and you don't have pallets, well, pallets got added a few updates before Inferno, but facilities really made artillery, like, the meta. Like, nothing else matters when you can auto pump out thousands of shells and just, like, super easily, and and the running of it is just, you bring up a pallet and you're not tied to a bunker base, and it became so much easier and so much stronger to spam artillery. Like, it was all down to facilities. Like, but I will say, the thing that made it so that the one thing that sort of kept artillery in check was the fact that, or rather, it didn't so much keep artillery in check as much as it made it so that artillery wasn't just the only thing to push. And that was, Conch was still, like, people were still getting used to, like, building better. Like, builders hadn't fully optimized their designs at this point. It was way better than, like, years prior, but it was still lacking. Like, if you're familiar with the now I believe they've now been patched out. Like all the little silly strats, like the bending and curving and the cursed corners and all of these weird like things that builders were doing like an update or two ago. Though that's all been patched out. It's like that was not a thing at the time because builders hadn't like figured it out en masse yet, and so concrete was a lot easier to kill, and artillery wasn't required to kill concrete. Obviously, devastation always helped, but most of the time you'd still see artillery or you'd still see infantry and armor. Your chieftain rushes, your ballista rushes, your satchel rushes, that would still be doing a lot of the conk killing in this era. That was one of the main things keeping artillery from being super meta, was that even in the late game, things were still pretty fluid because of satchels and because of satchels primarily. So ultimately, it was just like spam. It was just so much spam. Like you could because of the amount of shells that you could now produce, the Warden 150 could now brute force concrete if that was required. Colonial 150 couldn't because it's still pretty fucking dog shit. Like Thunderbolts just can't really brute force. They just can't. They're really, really bad. They're so bad, especially at this era. I don't know if they used to have even less health and less resistance, and they were just really bad. I also don't remember, there was a brief period where the Warden artillery had like a force field, so if you were gunning for it, you were just immune to damage. You couldn't be killed by Howie garrisons, so it was... Although, like, Wardens got a huge buff to their arty with 1.0, it wasn't like... It wasn't like things were impossible for Colonials, because despite having worse 150, like, keep in mind, the spams affected 120 as well, so the 120 unlock was very, like, strong for the Colonial mid-game, but again, late game is what matters at this point. Like, you're getting into the era of Foxhole where the only thing that matters is late game, and although 120s do see use in the late game, the level of use tends to be drastically less than 150s, primarily because you're facing concrete, and 120 just does not work against concrete. So, how do the tanks shake out in 1.0? As much as artillery was like the main massive change in terms of like the benefiting from facilities, tanks also saw a lot of changes with 1.0. The biggest was the reintroduction of battle tanks. Remember how they got taken out? Well, now they're back. This time with some many drawbacks that make them far less of the top dog that they used to be. In addition, they aren't even the top dog, because now the Wardens receive the exclusive super tank, the Epstein, aka the Predator. This was kind of a weird moment where 1.0, the devs decided that the Wardens would get a super tank, and that was it, and it was just kind of weird. I mean, like, at this point, you know that the Colonials are the infantry faction and the Wardens are the tank faction. It just feels weird that you're getting another time when there's just the whole class of vehicles where the Colonials just don't get anything. Now, if you actually play the game, you know I'm being facetious here. The Colonials got the miserable pile of dog shit that is the Ares, which is just... I'm not going to get into it. If you don't understand why those two vehicles, like, are... One was very, very strong on release, and the other was, like, just complete dog shit. Like, you're going to need a different video than what this one is focused on. That is a whole thing. Anyway, the HV push guns got heavily nerfed and swapped. Now, instead of having an anti-armor, like, this is where the Stygian gets introduced. So instead of the Smelter, the Colonials now have the Stygian. So although it had worse range and it was harder to spam because it cost steel and required facilities, it was super punishing against bad tank players, because with the Smelter, although the Smelter had good range and was better against the high-quality tank players, 90% of Foxhole tank players are not good tank players, so having something that punishes the bad players more just was kind of stronger in most cases, but weaker against, like, if you're fighting an outlaw goon that knows what they're doing, like Yeah. How do the rest of the tanks shake out? So, Colonial mediums still complete dog shit. Colonial battle tanks are not very. The Colonial tanks are solid as a support element, but definitely not the main bulk of what makes a Colonial push in this era. The Wardens, their battle tank sucks complete ass. I had a lot of fun stealing them and like going for joyrides in them, but like the stats on them just don't make them a battle tank. It's kind of good that they got the Predator because I don't envy the Warden battle tank. It's just not good. It's super, like, especially today, it's super power creeped. Yeah. Oh, I guess I will kind of get into the Predator here a little bit more, but the Predator has basically just the most absurd stats in the entire game. The only thing that was balancing it was the fact that it cost, I believe, 2 days to produce. So, yeah, that was interesting. It basically all of its stats were like double the mediums, meaning that like trying to kill it, even with a Stygian, was very difficult. You basically entirely had to rely on the Predator messing up, and it took, I think, like a week, like from the first Predator showing up on the front line to the first Predator actually dying. It took a while before the Colonials figured out how to counter it, and then once they figured out how to counter it, they started killing them very much like a snowball effect. Like the first kill came, and then it was like a day or two later that another kill came, and then like a couple days later, multiple died, and then it just stopped. It just ramped up. The super tank was no longer a thing to fear, but a piece of content to hunt down. It became a moment for Colonials to rally and hunt. It was the beast to be slain. Now, where does this all leave infantry? I've talked arty, I've talked tanks. Nothing. Not much really changed. Colonial infantry was still stronger. The Hydra's Whisper was an okay early demo option, because, again, Colonials just don't have a push 250, and, again, I want to harp on this again. Early game does not matter nearly as much at this point. It very much just doesn't. It's all about late game. So while this helped square up an area of imbalance, the complete lack of a Colonial demo option, it just wasn't a big deal. It was just like an, okay, I guess that's cool. That helps in the early game. There was still the Cutler with no counterpart, but the artillery changes, the artillery changes sort of muffled the power spike that Wardens felt, because I know that sounds a little weird, especially when I was just talking about how the Wasp Nest and the Wardens would push super hard with that power spike, but beyond 1.0, beyond like once the fire was nerfed and they added the fire truck and all that, the Colonial 120 sort of, the power boost it got was more significant than the Warden 120, just because the Colonial 120 is better. Not by much, but enough for it to count, that it sort of muffled the issue of having no Cutler counterpart. So the ultimate results of 1.0 were like Entrenched. Things were not really so skewed that any one faction won because of balance, but certainly balance was growing more unstable. Certain things like this was pretty much, if you want to think of it like what Winter Army was strong because there were so many absurd options on both teams, and then Entrenched was like balanced because things were just kind of put in line and each faction had one thing they were completely dominant at. This was sort of a slight return to form, except it was kind of a mix of both, where like Wardens had fire and these seemingly unstoppable super tanks, which totally just like gave them the edge in two entire areas of the game. But like Colonials learned how to like fight super heavies, and the game became about morale. Colonials did have the tools to win. It was not like the balance did not make it impossible to win. It was just mostly a morale factor, right? It was mostly the fact that Colonials were demoralized because the super tank seemed unkillable, but then the second it bled, well, if it bleeds, or in this case, if it like gets fuel leaked, it can be killed or whatever. I'm riffing on the one, it bleeds, it can kill it. But anyway, Ultimately, though, the relative balance would not last, and this might be a hot take. This upcoming update that I'm about to discuss is probably the worst update in the entire game's history. This was the... If you've heard the talking point relatively recently, around the time that this is being recorded, that Colonials have been on this, like, loss streak and only won, like, 30% of the wars in the last year or two, this is the update that did it. This is the... Well, the Great Colonial Tragedy. Update 52. So, the primary way to win in 1.0, from like War 96 through War 101, was a combination of tanks, infantry, and artillery supporting you, right? Because artillery was very strong now, but you still had satchels, you still had your other options to deal with conk. 52 is probably the most imbalanced update that also destroyed, like, an entire aspect of gameplay. Like, I don't know this. I don't want to dwell too much on, like, what I think of Foxhole game design. I want to mostly focus on asymmetry here, but you can't really avoid talking about how much this just, like, fundamentally removed infantry from being viable. So this is, like, there's only two reasons why, but, like, this update was just fucking horrible. I can't hold my tongue. This was just a complete disaster of an update. Like, Colonials were kind of winning a little bit in 1.0. I think it was mostly, again, if you remember, the whole balance and inertia thing, because Colonials won 1.0, and then there was a couple wars Wardens didn't really play as much, and then there was and then War 100, Colonials won again. After, like, a brutal 50, like, plus date, like, the longest war that had existed until that, like, time. Most wars only lasted, like, a month. Like, War 100 was the first war to last over 50 days, and it like, the previous longest was, like, in the low 40s. It lasted a fair bit longer than people were expecting, but, like, this update was so fucking terrible. Like, for two reasons. Again, the STD and the fact that the satchels were removed. So, the Lord's Car, aka the Lord's Scar, this tank was gifted by God to the Wardens to cement the Warden tank rule. So, remember how I said the Predator was strong because it had, like, kind of absurd stats? It was, like, all double what a medium had, and it had, like, super high damage, super high speed, very repairable, all that. So you cut a few of those, but you cut the most important, the production time and cost. What are you left with? If you cut the HP of it, and you cut the production time, you're left with the most broken vehicle the game has ever seen. Something that was a high-speed 94mm vehicle, one of only 3 in the game at the time. Actually, no, that's wrong. I believe 4, because the BTD. My slide is wrong. Sorry, had to sip water, been talking a while. The Predator was very strong, but the existence of the Lord Scar just... It was a tank with basically no downsides. It was super high speed, super high damage, like, and it still had the Silverhand's armor. So, what was its real downside? It didn't have a roof, but it wasn't the same way that the LTD didn't have a roof, because if you ever tried to fight a Lord's Car and tried to decrew it, you'd know that the roof on it kind of like, with an LTD, you can kind of shoot the infantry out the back. All of the walls on the Lord's Car extended up higher, so as an infantry, you can't really shoot in and kill the infantry. And on top of that, the hitbox was bugged, again, just like the Outlaw, to where half the time, the seat that was getting decrewed the most was the driver's seat through the driver port, because for some reason there was just a missing, like, wall there. Like, when I say this was one of the most... I don't know how I can really express this. This is, again, another brain-breaking balance decision where I know it's the whole morale thing, and it doesn't feel fair if you get the whatever, but like, I think that I think that especially like I don't think that the whole player power curve or balancing around morale, I don't think it works, frankly, because I think it just incentivizes bad behavior where players will intentionally throw or constantly complain or just drum up their feelings to lie in feedback so that like they'll try to get dev handouts for like better balance and they can just win wars easy, right? But I think that becomes less of an issue later down the line. But at this point in time, the Lord's Car was basically a tank with no downside that had better stats than every other vehicle in the entire game, with like that could be spammed. It was just high spam, high stats, obscene, just completely obscene. But if you know anything about the modern Lord's Car, you'd know that it took, while it did absurdly, some fucking how, it took 2 wars before this thing got a nerf. It's not really the reason that why this update was so bad. It's not the thing that completely just questionably destroyed the game design of Foxhole, the fundamental like balance pyramid of all the different aspects of gameplay. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I've rambled too long. Let me talk more about the Lord's Car, I guess. Yeah, so the Stygian and the BTD soft countered it, but because it had more speed and because the Stygian could just die to artillery, the Stygian didn't really work against a supported push against the Lord's Car, and the BTD took like 16 hours to make. Like, the BTD isn't exactly like cheap. It's not exactly expensive either, but like comparing a medium tank that has to be upgraded in a facility versus something that takes 16 hours, you're just, even if the BT, like, keep in mind though, the BTD would often lose fights against the like a single STD purely because the STD could maneuver more and get like on the side of the BTD or force it to like fight in unfavorable situations, right? That was the main like issue. Like, I could not. The biggest point of comparison was basically if you remember back when I was talking during the LTD versus STD era, the LTD just totally shut down the Silverhand. This was basically, the STD was so powerful it saw the return of one faction just doesn't have a chance in the late game. Like, it was that bad. It was just, the Lord's Car completely shut down the ability for colonial tanks to just exist. Like, and I know I said, I know I've been saying colonials are the infantry-focused faction. Just because one faction has a focus on something doesn't mean that, that's how a faction wins, doesn't mean you can neglect it. Like, anyone knows that if you try to do a Warden armored column, you'll still die to, like, you'll die because you open yourself up to getting ganked by colonial infantry if you don't have infantry covering your tanks, right? Like, that's the whole point of it, right? Is you still have to use the things that you have that are worse, because if you don't, you're at a disadvantage, right? But the STD just fundamentally, completely just broke that aspect of the game, right? The bigger thing, though, was the thing that killed the colonial faction, I think, until modern day. So, to get into why the satchel removal was so bad, let's just break it down. How does concrete die? Well, prior to update 52, you had a couple of options. So, as a colonial, you'd use satchels or the ballista, right? You could technically use a thunderbolt, but like that's a technical in a very like, it can technically kill it, but that's sort of like trying to kill a tank with an SMG. It technically does damage, not really though, if you've ever tried to do it, right? It's very, very annoying, lobotomized, and not very effective if the enemy at all shows up to repair. Meanwhile, if you're a warden, you have satchels, chieftain, cutler, brute force with 150 if everything else fails, right? Like again, this was before, I believe this was before or around the time that the Lunaire and Tremola came into existence. I believe it was like around this period, but Cutler. I know it looks like colonials have far fewer options than the Warden. I want to really heavily emphasize that the main way is War, Satchels, and Chieftain. Like, Wardens had more variety in what they could technically do, but the strongest aspect of the Warden anti-conk kit was the Chieftain, because it could deal with infantry, and like infantry QRF, and it could be in and out very quickly, right? Satchels, meanwhile, for Wardens had worse infantry, so their satchels weren't as effective, right? And of course, the Exalt can actually kill conk. Like, it just works. It just does it. Like, it's still hard. It's still very hard, but it's actually possible. So, like, ultimately this gets into specialty versus variety. Colonials were very all-in on the satchel. Colonials had an infantry focus. The infantry was how they won wars, right? So, when you have a satchel, and you have a better infantry, the satchel is your main way of doing it, right? You technically have the ballista, but that's the only other realistic option that you have, right? Again, and yeah, so while Warden Cutlers do threaten the conk, Colonials didn't have Lunaire or the higher damage Tremola, and even then, Tremola, Lunaire against conk, or Cutler versus conk, these are very much niche options that only really work during low pop. The lack of variety for Colonials did matter, but it didn't matter nearly as much as, well, losing an entire option. Because, so, how do you kill conk when there's no satchels? Well, now you can use the ballista, but, I mean, when builders don't have to worry about satchels, they just sort of double down on anti-infantry. They just started using MG garrisons and more of them, right? Like, because if you don't, or sorry, not MG, they started using ATGs and more of them. Like, instead of the old metas that would have like 1 to 2 ATGs and a couple like rifles and MG garrisons, because you had to worry about satchels, now having to worry exclusively about ballista because infantry doesn't really pose a threat anymore except for the Lunaire, like, you just double up on ATGs and now every ballista rush is less effective, right? The same thing sort of goes for Wardens, but because, again, the Chieftain is just far better than the ballista. It's just way better, especially in this era. The ballistic does get some buffs later down the line, but in this era, indisputably, way the fuck stronger. Just so much stronger than the ballista, right? And so Colonials are left with a method that they already had, but now is weaker because the builders can build more to counter it, and the Wardens are left with a similar amount of like a similar-ish amount of options, except their options are the Chieftain that are stronger, or they can use Artie. And you saw in Update 52 a major uptick in the amount of like artillery that like started being mandatory for killing conk, and just not having viable 150 just, well, like ultimately this just made the Colonials kind of irrelevant. Like, the Colonials finally had a Cutler counterpart, but the main strength of the Cutler was always the early to mid-game, like, strength of PvEing Tier 2, killing watchtowers, or doing partisan work, right? Cutlers and Lunaires aren't, like, and I know you're gonna, like, or not you, but I know you can find, like, clips of people killing conk with these things, but the issue isn't if it can, the issue is how frequently does it, because it's not about killing one concrete base. The reason that the loss of the satchel made such a difference is because satchels were the go-to option for the war needs to end, therefore, if one faction stops playing, your stuff will explode. Like, the whole point of the satchel for the 6 years that it was in the game prior to Update 52, from 2017 all the way to 2023, the whole reason the satchel existed as a late game option was, hey, the war is kind of long, you're kind of in the late game, if things are still lasting, here's an option that will blow up everything. Go blow up all of your opponent's stuff now, because the war needs to end. It was the ultimate, like, doomsday clock for finishing wars. Not having that just kind of broke the way Foxhole works, and Foxhole no longer just, or much longer, lasted. That's grammatically incorrect, but Foxhole just became a even slower game than it was prior. Like, Wardens still used satchels, so, like, again, this did affect them, but the meta just became very artillery and ballista slash chieftain focused. Those were the primary ways of doing it, and Wardens just had it better. Like, infantry became largely irrelevant outside of killing tanks, but again, you're not really, like, tanks are also mattering less, because the whole power of tanks was being able to act as a force multiplier for your infantry to let your infantry go and satchel the conch, right? Like, tanks can't deal with conch on their own. The ballista slash chieftain can, but those are only during rushes, and those rushes are a lot harder to pull off during high pop, like, sieges, right? So ultimately, you're left in a situation where infantry is irrelevant. Tanks don't really have anything to support outside of just, like, the artillery. And the slide is kind of broken, so I don't know how this actually ends. But yeah, our infantry was just kind of irrelevant at this point. So, huge step backwards in terms of balance. The Lord Scar rampaged for 2 fucking wars before it was actually nerfed. And the loss of satchels made colonials just complete ass. You did see colonials win a couple wars in this era, but this was, I believe, largely born out of just, like, break war type situations, rather than necessarily like, oh, if both factions go all out, it's an even chance. Again, that's sort of why you get the 30% win rate on the colonials, is because the reason it's not 0 is because it's not like both factions are going to go super hard every single war. At the end of the day, people burn out, people play less, and there's opportunities to win wars where the enemy just doesn't play as much. But on average, which is what matters, colonials did not have nearly the same competitiveness because of this change. So, yeah. Like, this period lasted for about 9 months before any colonial tanks got buffed, but 8 months before the ballista buffs. The BTD technically got an armor buff during some random update, but, like, that didn't change anything, like, at all. Again, armor Wardens having better tanks didn't matter as much as, like, having better arty. That was, like, again, with arty being buffed, and arty being, like, one of the main ways that conch would die at this point, it's just, that's sort of just what happened, is, like, armor mattered less. So, now we get into naval warfare. After, you might be noticing a pattern where I'm not really covering the minor updates as much as the major updates, and that's largely born out of the fact that, actually, I covered the update 48, update 52, but for the most part, the things that really radically shake up balance happen in these major updates, such as naval warfare, which had good gameplay, but it didn't really fix the balance issue. Especially, I'm going to focus purely because, although I prefer to focus on land, the naval aspect of Foxhole does matter, and it's been shown to matter a couple times. It doesn't matter every war, but some wars the naval aspect will win. Wardens the war. So naval warfare launched, and if you were there for it, you'll know that Wardens just completely lacked a destroyer counterpart, and colonials lacked a sub counterpart. So, yeah, that was a really interesting decision to just leave out, like, half of the content, but you can imagine it had quite an adverse effect on balance. So it was weird. This was a really weird era of naval balance, because the Naki sucked complete ass. They just didn't do anything. and the destroyer was better because it could threaten land and it could fight gunboats and it just could do things. Where the Naki, the thing that the Naki could do was sneaking into backline areas and PvEing ships that were anchored. That was it. That was how it would kill boats. You'd stack like 100 goons in the back of your Naki, and you'd just load them all up, holding torpedoes on their arms, and just like funnel them behind enemy lines and just kill boats that way. You could not at all PvP with a sub. It was complete ass. Yeah. Things were quite colonial favored outside of things like the Wardens having a way better gunboat. I will say though, like part of the reason that things were colonial favored is on top of the destroyer. I don't know how many people like this is. I'm going to touch on a very irrelevant area of balance because of how naval actually works these days, but colonials in this era had the better battleship as well, which if you look at the stats at all, you'd think that's really a really weird statement. I think the colonial battleship is better because of one main reason, and that's ergonomics, which I know sounds really weird, but most of the time when you're looking at a Foxhole vehicle, you're evaluating it purely on the stats because that's what matters, right? How many crew does it take to run? How many how many guns does it have? How much damage does it output? What's its pen rate? What's its health? What's its repair rate? How fast is it? Like those are what matter for tanks. But with battleships specifically, they had the exact same amount of damage output between the Wardens having 3 150s and the Colonials having 2. The two Colonial turrets have a faster fire rate, which it roughly shakes out to about what is it? It roughly shakes out to about a shell every second or so. When you factor in all the guns, it's like the two Colonial guns firing once every 2 seconds, 3 Warden guns firing once every 3 seconds. But the main reason was the ergonomics of the Colonial one was far easier to do shell running, to repair. The Warden one was kind of cramped. You had to have more gunners, especially. It should be noted, Naval is one of the most skill-intensive areas of Foxhole, but I will, or at least during this specific, I should specify surface combat. Actually, all of Naval is skill-intensive, like every aspect of it, but the balance doesn't matter so much. Like a good Warden battleship crew would smoke a bad Colonial battleship thing, right? When I say the ergonomics are better, I mean that it makes it easier to be a good crew on a Colonial battleship because it's easier to move around in, it's easier to repair in, it's just, yeah. Anyway, that's like a side tangent, but like the main issue with the Naval update isn't actually within the Naval update itself. It's the Torps, which happened later. So when Torps got buffed, it was really interesting because Torps didn't get buffed until Colonials had a submarine, right? So you might think, okay, well, if both factions have these super oppressive, super overpowered torpedoes, well then, how is this a balance issue? And if you're not an idiot, you'll notice, oh, wait a minute, there's having access to this matters in how it's deployed, right? Like the Naki is a highly maneuverable, very easy to run, low crew requirement, PvP focused ship, right? And the Trident is a total piece of shit. The Trident is strong because it has torpedoes and for nothing else. The Naki is strong because it is highly maneuverable, very easy to stay undetected, very easy to maneuver in combat. Like, even if you get discovered, even if you get caught out, there's a high likelihood that you can maneuver and get a torp off on the people that are trying to, kill you, assuming it's a destroyer, right? Where the Trident is so big, so lethargic, that it is just total ass, right? Like, that is the major discrepancy after the torp buff in terms of balance. Of course, gunboats still exist, and gunboats are still Warden favored. Destroyer versus frigate, is pretty even. I've seen people claim they're one way or the other. It's all down to skill in that like matchup. Colonials still have the stronger battleship, but battleships don't exist to PvP. They exist primarily to like actually fight land targets, right? And if you can't actually fight in naval because all of your PvP options are worse, well, colonials just kind of stop doing naval. And now there's some people, there's some LARPers that'll say like, oh, colonials don't do naval because of X, Y, and Z and whatever. The primary reason is the torp difference. Like, people will say like, oh, it's the gunboats and the gun. Like, if you wonder why colonials still don't do naval as much, even like after the gunboat rebalanced, where the gunboats are mostly balanced now, the main reason why is because randoms don't win wars, okay? It's the clans. The clans are going to be the people that mobilize the manpower, that do the operations, to do the things that actually have war impact, right? And so having better gunboats that you have like randoms in doesn't matter as much if the primary PvP vessel, the submarine, is just worse. So no colonial, like none of the colonial vets are incentivized to play naval because you're just vastly outclassed. So there's just a skill discrepancy in naval where wardens have the more skilled players because all of the skilled players on colonial just don't want to do something where they're just blatantly outclassed for no benefit, right? Like, and they just have to work far harder and burn themselves out doing a thing that they're outnumbered in, that they're just outclassed in. There's just no reason for colonials to really touch naval outside of deterring warden naval. Like, you can't translate it to a colonial, like, surface win or island win or landings or anything because the balance is just so off because of the torpedo discrepancy, because of the torpedo platform discrepancy. So with the tirade into the oceans away, let's focus on naval. So with SPGs, the colonials finally get a viable artillery piece for the late game, right? Obviously, randoms can't use it. Obviously, a lot of clans find it harder to field. Obviously, SPGs are pretty expensive, hard to store, all of that shit, right? Like, you can't just do an SPG op on a whim. They're a lot harder to set up. So, ultimately, the SPG, like, I think the Colonial SPG is better than the Warden one. They're both viable. They're both strong. But the difference mattered more for Colonials, who didn't have a strong anti-concrete arty option before, and now just suddenly do. In addition, Naval Update initially had ballista buffs, where it got brought more in line with the Chieftain. It got a slight armor buff going from 0.4 min pen to 0.3 min pen. If you don't understand what that means, I'm not explaining it. It's the penetration rates anyway. The ballista was still worse, but not by much. It got a speed buff. It got a pen buff. It was ultimately more reasonable. The major downside, though, is that the Stygian was nerfed to no longer kill people if they had, like, even a modicum of awareness. You know how to deploy it, so no one would ever die to a Stygian because the Stygian couldn't actually maneuver to engage. It was a static target, very easy to circumvent, and only the absolute worst of the worst players would die to it, or you'd get tracked, and then it would slowly, lethargically push up to you, take 3 seconds to deploy, and then just shoot at you, and probably kill you because you couldn't move. But, yeah, so as much as the Stygian nerf hurt, making Colonials not, like, have a strong anti-tank option, the Colonials got something good, the Spatha buff. This was where the Spatha gained an autoloader, basically, and it went from a 7-second reload to a 4.5-second reload, which was a very high DPS increase. Now, the thing is, Spatha was still not really a line fighter, but it was good at brawling, and it was good at PvEing, so it was now one of your strongest options as a Colonial tanker. But how do... I'll get to something else in a second about how wars win, but first, Pond Gaming. in the same way that facilities caused artillery to just like reveal the blatant artillery imbalances that didn't really show off as much because artillery was harder to spam, naval sort of revealed map imbalances. Basically, remember how in update 26, way back like 4 years ago, prior to this, in 2019, like 4 years prior to the end of 2023 when we got the naval update, the optimal way to win was pushing the outer lanes, right? Because those were the lanes that were closest to the Logi hubs, that you could nuke the Logi hubs, you could capture the Logi hubs. That's how you win. Well, because one faction had a way easier time taking all of the islands and being uncontested at sea, you get this sort of situation. It's called pond gaming, but what it really is having uncontested naval assets, striking land positions. So if you ever try to do a push that's along a coastline where the enemy can bring in a large ship, you can't do a push there. It just can't happen. They will come in with a frigate, and they will unleash infinite 120 millimeters on your bunker, and you cannot out-repair. Something I should note is that everything I am saying is, again, in context of the time. There's certain changes that have just been made to the game that might change the way that this works to make this less of a thing, but at the time that I am referencing, the meta of pushing the outer lanes just totally stops working, right? Wardens can push the outer lanes, but Colonials can't because it's naval access, right? In addition, there's a couple ways into the backline regions, and for Colonials, these are heavily focused around water choke points, right? Especially certain town halls, like... Sorry, needed water. One of the most notable is, as a Colonial, you can't take Buckler Sound in Stone Cradle. The reason for this is that town hall is in range of ponds, the Warden Pond in Stone Cradle, whereas if you look at something like Mercy's Whale in Alad's Blight, that town hall is not in range of Colonial naval assets in the Colonial Pond. So in a couple of different locations, there's often ways where the Wardens can far more easily contest if the Colonials are pushing into the backline, or, again, along the outer lanes, just purely due to the way the map is structured, or the way that or the way that Colonials being reliant on pushing those outer lanes doesn't work as well when you can't actually push because of the naval assets like shutting down your by harassing you from sea. So this sort of ultimately meant that you had to, as a Colonial, push the center. That's the only way you could win. Like, ultimately, the naval update and its subsequent updates were kind of a step in the right direction after update 52, but over a year later, Naval's still imbalanced. The Naki is still way better, even after the Trident got a turn rate buff and a couple other buffs. Land-based warfare is relatively balanced. There's still issues like with the ballista buff and the existence of SPGs, things became far more closely balanced. But because of the way that naval affected how you can push, Colonials pushing to end a war became damn near impossible in certain situations if you were trying to push the outer lanes. If Colonials managed to get in deep enough via a center lane, it was technically possible, but very difficult still, right? Ultimately, though, the land-based assets were pretty balanced. The main issues of the naval update were that the naval balance was bad. So, now, what about the infantry update? So, this was the most recent major update. I know Airborne is coming out soon, but we're gonna, this was the 2024 major update, and I'll touch briefly on it, but this is mostly going to be going back to, I had said I wanted to talk about how wars are won. So technically, okay, things are mostly balanced with the infantry update, is what I'll say. The only major issue is that the infantry update doesn't really address the balancing problems at all. It doesn't even address the game design issues of what makes infantry so bad. The reason the infantry update happened in 2024 is because Update 52 made all of the infantry players upset because they no longer had a role in the game outside of building the bases for the arty and protecting the arty. That was it. That was all you did as infantry, right? You were no longer like usually like or putting on some pressure on the builders or whatever, right? Like obviously you still do other things, but like your primary role was more as support as infantry rather than actually having the means to threaten things yourself outside of some niche scenarios, right? So ultimately the infantry update just doesn't deliver on what infantry players were looking for, and it kind of just tweaks infantry gameplay to be different. And that's kind of a shame, but there's not really as much I can touch on here. Like, it didn't add... And it added the Nemesis, which was, like, solid. It nerfed the Spatha, which was, like, I disagreed with that nerf, but, like, I don't think it was that impactful, ultimately. It added the Brigand and buffed the shit out of the Outlaw to holy fuck, it's... Anyway, the whole thing is that the infantry update just doesn't change stuff, but, like, the major issue is that it's just hard to close out wars, and because it's hard to close out wars, you just, like, the things that, like, the small discrepancies in balance matter more when it's harder to close out wars. So, although most of the land assets are balanced, the issue with the fact that Wardens had a naval advantage means that the Wardens get to leverage that advantage until it actually results in meaningful, like, stuff, right? So, again, actually, fuck me. Okay, I'm really bad with the slides, but yeah, it was kind of the I hate infantry update. The update, honest to God, mostly nerfed infantry. The shotguns were overpowered. The hit registration was terrible. It's kind of been buffed, or not buffed, it's kind of been improved in this latest update, but I still don't think it's back to what it should be. The shouldering system, everything about infantry was just slower and didn't really address the issue that infantry just doesn't have impact, like I was saying, right? 20mm got nerfed and was no longer viable. It mostly affected Wardens. Like the Outlaw, or was it not the Outlaw? The Highwayman is a complete meme. It is completely useless. It does nothing now. Yeah, that's... Nothing really happened, but Havoc charges are still quite useless, though, at least during this era. Now that breaching is the thing, this update, with this most recent update, as of time of recording, hopefully the Havoc can actually be good. Given its stats, it's 75% chance to breach. I think it will be good, but it's still quite cumbersome, so I'm going to hold my tongue before I make any conclusive statements on if I think the Havoc is viable or not. I think it will be, but I'm prepared to be disappointed. So, okay, god damn it. Yeah, the Nemesis and the new Outlaw. Okay, look, like I was saying, the main point I'm trying to make here is that all of the things from the past just don't matter as much. The LTD with the new Outlaw is just totally power crept out of existence. HCD, which was the strongest thing for a long time, the Nemesis was kind of a direct counter to it. But at the end of the day, the land balance was mostly fine. That wasn't the main issue. The issue is that just wars last too long, and it's all about these minute different, like, and I want to say this, like, when I say that these minute differences get compounded because of how long the wars last, obviously morale still matters, but, like, the morale is informed by the discrepancy in balance, right? Like, it's less that the balance difference of naval, like, directly causes colonials to lose, right? It's that the discrepancy in naval balance causes there to be more warden players, and it causes colonial morale to be worse, so that colonial players don't log on as much. So, yeah, it's an indirect issue. Like, ultimately, there aren't a ton of problems with the infantry update. It's just kind of disappointed. You kind of just have to wait for the enemy to stop playing. Naval's imbalanced, and for the sake of future balance, let's just hope Airborne doesn't horribly mangle the balance, leaving one faction non-viable for years at a time, just like Update 52, but I think we all know it will. Oh, that's the final slide. Anyway, yeah. I don't have a like a solid closer to end on here, but I will just state that ultimately, I hope you take away from this just like the way Foxhole's developed, and why I'm sort of happy that this newest update might, with breaching, might let infantry be more viable, because you're at it, because we're seeing more infantry tools or options for infantry to have an effect in like against or around concrete. I don't know. I can't fully say if things will be better from here, but it seems like a positive reversal against the initial satchel removal with the havoc and all that. So if you've enjoyed this, I don't subscribe, I don't fucking upload anything, but leave a like, leave a comment. If you think I'm biased, I am. Fuck you. I'm recording this at 2 a.m., so I I'd say I'm tired and I'm forgetting things, but that's a lie. I'm gonna probably stay up till like 6 in the morning, so I have a couple up more hours in me. But if you want to discuss anything, please do in the comments. If you want to talk about it, at me on FOD, and I'll completely ignore you. But yeah, I do hope, I do sincerely hope you enjoyed this, even if you disagree. Just threw this on, listening to it. I've been rambling. This has been long. The whole point of this is mostly to like get some thoughts I've been having out there for other people, and sort of to act as an informational for newer players. So if you're new and you've learned something, again, like, do all that bullshit. I don't fucking I might upload more of this, probably not, but anyway, take care.